Well, so without further ado, we've got Dan Dubowski. So 20 years as a post-breacher. He's now over at Equifax. He's the deputy CISO, good friend. Yeah, love everything you're doing, and I appreciate it. He's coming out from Atlanta, and he's going to be talking about what he's been doing and why he's become a post-breacher in regards to everything that he does, and when he comes in, what does that really look like and what he finds. So without further ado, Mr. Dubowski, hand it off to you.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate it. So first of all, thank you everyone for sticking it out. I actually thought I was going to be standing between you, dinner, and drinks. Now I realize I'm after all of that, so the fact that any of you are still here, absolutely amazing, and I appreciate it. Second, look, let's give it up to all the vendors that you've met here today. Hopefully you learned a lot of great things. We wouldn't be here without them. Obviously, our sponsors, Eric and the company, right? So really great job of putting on this event. I learned a lot. I also got an opportunity to talk to a lot of you about what you're struggling with and obviously learning about some of the technologies that are being presented here. I thought I would take maybe a little bit of different spin than just talk about Equifax. If you have not heard about the Equifax breach, let's just do a poll. How many people have not heard about the Equifax breach? Not, right? How many of you have been impacted as a result? I should see how many didn't even bother to check that they were impacted, right? So I'm sure all of you will know a lot of the details. There's a lot of information that's put out. I thought I would do something a little bit different and go back and give you a little bit more about the rest of my career and how I ended up at Equifax. Originally, I was born in Poland under communistic rule. My family ran away, and we were successful enough to have a passport, so we were able to, quote-unquote, go away for vacation to Greece. We never really came back. So we sought political asylum through Athens. At that time, we talked to the US consulate, and 4 years later, after a bunch of physical tests, evaluations, everything else, we as a family came to the States as citizens. I spent my time growing up in Chicago, where I then went to school in University of Illinois Champaign, studied mathematics, specifically elliptic key cryptography and cryptography in general, computer science. And then moved on to my first job. And one of my first jobs was working for a company called D.R. Horton, which at the time was the largest home builder in the country. That's where I encountered my first of 5 breaches that I've dealt with. Right? And I kind of want to maybe take focus on what are the lessons learned from each one of them. Because somebody recently asked me, it's like, you know, you've been through 5 breaches. Either you're the most unlucky person in the world, you're a glutton for punishment, you know, what's the lesson learned? And it just floored me. Like I could not answer the question. I was too focused on fixing and reacting to the breaches that I didn't take time to just pause and go, well, what was the lesson learned from all those events? Like the 80 hours just remediating, rebuilding, fixing, trying to Phoenix Project an entire security program from scratch. So the first breach happened at D.R. Horton. It was a WebSphere vulnerability, 0-day, that was exploited, and is actually part of the mortgage department that got hit, where all the underwriting data for mortgages existed. It happened in sometime in between, December and January of 2012, and at that point, we knew that the vulnerability existed. We warned the organization that the vulnerability existed. We had all those conversations, we had all the metrics, we showed every piece of data we can possibly show them, and yet we were overruled because it was the end of the year, right? The business process was more important than our credibility in convincing our senior leadership that something had to be done about this. Right? And I think that was my first takeaway from that breach. It was the fact that regardless of how good we thought our program was, regardless of the technologies and the tools that we had to identify that there was a problem, we didn't have a strong enough relationship with the business, and we didn't have the trust necessary to be able to convince them that this was a higher priority and this was something that would have material impact to the organization. From then on, I think that has stuck with me for the entire career, and one of the things I encourage all of you to do is to make sure that you have the right level of exposure to the business and are partnering with them to understand not only their business processes, but also where their risks might exist. You know, that is a key component in almost every organization and every industry, and I've had the, the luxury of jumping to different verticals in different industries each time. But that is key and fundamental to almost every organization that I've been at. So a couple of years later, I move on to another organization, or I get called to an organization by the name of IHG Intercontinental Hotels. And I'm coming in as a result of a couple of breaches that that organization had at the time. One of them was a massive ransomware that impacted what is typically called a franchise owner. So if you know anything about hospitality, IHG had about 6,000 hotels. Only 10 of them are actually owned by IHG. Only 300 of them are managed by IHG. The rest of them are pretty much franchise models, right? Which the owner owns, the owner operates, and in most cases has a lot of flexibility to decide what technology goes in, what security measures go in, and essentially they're just buying a flag, right? They're putting the IHG logo on the company. So I came into that program after two breaches, and the focus was to basically rebuild the entire program from scratch. And the lesson learned from that one is it was a well-funded program. There was a lot of people. There was a lot of support. There was a lot of tools and technologies. I walked into a portfolio of 100+ security products in that space. The challenge that I encountered was that more than half of them weren't even deployed. The other ones that were deployed to minimal functionality, and very few of them at the time actually interoperated with each other. Right? So this was before the whole big wave of API integration and single-click functionality and data flow between all of them. So the takeaway there, and hopefully it's common sense to you, and hopefully you see it as well, is the technologies that we use for our programs have to work well with each other. They have to be integrated. They have to be seamless, because I'm sure none of you have endless budgets. I'm sure none of you have endless resources to manage them. And that was one of the biggest challenges that I ran into. It's this epiphany of going, I can have a better program if it's actually leaner. Yet again, using the lessons learned from the first breach is, am I really putting in the controls and the technologies that are safeguarding what the business is trying to do, or am I just blasting every single security tool out there that I can possibly imagine? Right? We have this concept, or hopefully you've heard this, MVP, minimum viable program. Right? Every single company should go, what is the minimum amount of tools that I need to be able to run a successful program? So we spent almost 2 years rebuilding a global environment that supported 350,000 employees globally. We couldn't do things like geofencing because we operated in 172 countries at the time. And there was a lot of things that just had to come together right. If you've ever have not had a breach but want to experience a breach, I highly recommend working for a hospitality company. They are ripe. No, I kid you not. They are ripe for a breach almost every 2 years, and I'll tell you why. Most of the hospitality companies are a trifecta of hospitality, food and beverage, as well as retail. All of them are ripe with credit cards. So for a company like IHG, we had 100 million rewards members or loyalty members. There was an average of 3 credit cards per reward member. So now you're looking at 300 million plus credit cards on an average basis. Every 2 years, somebody's credit card expires, they get a new one. The hackers come back, repop a hospitality company. You've seen it with Marriott, you've seen it with Wyndham, you've seen it with IHG. So they're incredibly big targets for those type of credit card attacks. I don't want to get into the controls that we implemented, right? We went down a very big path of tokenization out of space. We went for end-to-end encryption on the POSs, and really thought we had a great program going. So 2 years into my program there, I decided to go and buy a breach. And you go, well, how do you buy a breach? We were acquiring smaller hospitality companies, and for better or for worse, in the due diligence process, we were slightly overruled on how much due diligence we're actually going to be able to do. And within a month of purchasing a smaller hospitality company, I had the Homeland Security, FBI, MasterCard, Visa, and American Express all come to me and say, look, Common Point of Purchase is telling us that you guys screwed up somewhere. And we can tell you exactly where you screwed up because it's in Chicago. So you realize that the lesson learned there is not only do you have to really focus on due diligence, especially if you're in the acquisition space, but more importantly, it's building the relationships with resources that you don't think you need until you need them. Right? So since then, I am on a first-name basis with the local FBI agents in Atlanta. Chad Hunt, who recently retired, has actually been on a talking circuit talking about all those breaches that I've been involved in for the last 5 years. So bless him, he's not retired. Maybe he can talk about something else. But having those type of relationships for when you need them is incredibly important. You don't know that you're going to use them, but when the things hit the fan, that's where your time is of the essence, and you really want to make sure you have access to those types of resources. So that was I think, if we're counting, number 4. Sorry, that was number 3. Only a couple months later, I encounter another breach in our IHG estate. Very similar threat actor. So they were going after POS systems. I won't name the company, but I'm sure you can figure it out. Everything I'm telling you here, by the way, has been very publicly disclosed, right? We had to report every single one of these. We had to disclose the information. And part of the franchise estate where we didn't have the control or the management of the technology and security was popped by the same type of POS software. So we wake up and Krebs is blasting an article that 1,200 hotels, of course IHG hotels, they never reference that it's Billy Joe's hotel down the street. It's always IHG, Marriott, and the flag and the parent company, right? So they blast he blasts this article. Of course, I reach out to him and say, look, I can't share the details of why you're wrong, but you're wrong. But the challenge there is that media will portray you in any light that they think they can. And unfortunately, it will typically go in a direction that sells. So they will tend to overemphasize. The details were that out of those 1,200 hotels, we only had about 12 that were truly impacted because of the other things I mentioned previously, right? We already had end-to-end encryption. We already had tokenization. So there was only about 12 hotels that still didn't go through that transformation and were truly impacted where consumer data and consumer credit cards were lost. That being said, it didn't matter, right? The news went out. It was a bad impact. It was an impact to the stock. It was an impact to revenue. And obviously in the court of public opinion, we yet again screwed up. So lesson learned there. Make sure you have good relationships with your comm teams. It's very critical and important to get ahead of some of these issues or these conversations. Otherwise, you allow the media to take control of the situation, right? Make sure you have good relationships with your legal departments. In those cases, you're going to be flying by the seat of your pants trying to determine what you can say, what you can't say, how do you approach some of these situations. Those are the kind of things that particular breach taught me. We recovered. We obviously fixed those issues. And then because of the sensitivity of all those impacts, we were really focused on making sure our program was solid. So that's right around 2016 and 2017 where we're scrambling for a lot of different 0 days that came out those years. But more specifically, Apache Struts vulnerability comes out. And I'm scrambling to get the whole team to fix everything that's impacting us. But at the same time, as hopefully some of you do, you reach out to some of your colleagues at other companies and go, hey, are you focused on this? Are you patching this? Are you working on this as feverishly as we are? And of course, everybody will tell you, yeah, we got this covered or we're working on it. I just happened to call some people over at Equifax. And of course, I got the same answer, like, yeah, we got this. So I hung up the phone and said, they got it. Lo and behold, only a couple months later, I was in the same boat as most of you. I was impacted by the breach, and I'm like, man, I didn't want to be Captain Obvious at that time. But at the same time, I'm like, this shouldn't have happened, right? And rather than with the spirit of this whole summit, rather than going, haha, you know, you got breached and everything else, which I very frequently see a lot of us doing. I can't tell you how much empathy is required for somebody that is dealing with a breach. Hopefully you realize it's a tough thing to go through, and whether you come in afterwards or whether you were there during, it's one of the most painful things that you can experience as a security practitioner. So my empathy kicked in, and my running towards the threat or running towards the challenge kicked in, and I said, look, I think this is going to be a good opportunity to pursue, because based on everything that I've experienced thus far, companies actually are better after a breach. I'm not trying to convince you to go out and have a breach just so you can experience that cultural change or get the necessary funding or the senior leadership support, but breaches are things that actually make companies stronger. So with that mindset in mind, I decided to join Equifax as everybody was running out of the building. Right? One of the first teams I joined was tried to rebuild, was the identity access management team. That team was cratered to about only 6 people, and the challenge was to rebuild it to near 80 in a span of 6 months, and obviously deal with every single issue that IAM had at the time, consolidation of tools, all kinds of different strategies we had to play out. Then they threw out cryptographic services, because they realized I actually have a degree in that. So they go, hey, why don't you just take care of every single key management and encryption tool solution, all the KMSs, all the HSMs, just go nuts with that, right? So we took that over, and at the same time, we were trying to create a strategy for how we were going to leverage the breach to move our entire infrastructure, and at least in my business unit, 750 products, into public cloud, right? So the breach was actually the catalyst for us to now move into a whole new environment and hopefully rebuild a lot of the applications that we were using and start completely from scratch. That's really where we kind of gravitated to the fundamentals and the principles of what we wanted to do, and we call it the 4 C's. Right? So the 4 C's were, we focused on our customers, we focused on the culture, we focused on the controls, and then finally we focused on the compliance. Right? And between those 4 main pillars, we had strategies that allowed us to regain some of the trust of the customers that were impacted, and hopefully you can make the distinction between what a customer and a consumer is for our perspective. Most of our customers are large institutions, right? In fact, one of the worst things that I've heard post-breach were many articles that referenced that the consumers were actually the product. Right? We obviously never thought of consumers that way, but this whole concept that we were trying to regain the trust of the customers rather than consumers was probably very erroneously portrayed. So the culture aspect was probably the most impactful pillar, and the lessons learned that we took away from that is there are changes that any organization can make, small or large, that I think are fundamental to a successful security program. One of the first things that we did is hello? All right. I think it's low on battery. We changed the organizational reporting structure. We are one of the only 5% of companies that have the global CISO reporting to the CEO. So we removed security from underneath technology. We also didn't put security underneath general counsel or the legal arm. And that was instrumental to successfully getting what we needed in order to fix some of the issues. As far as my role was elevated or moved from underneath technology as well, and it was moved under the president of the business unit that we support. So now we're talking about having a direct line to the business, as well as being part of the strategic initiatives for that business. Yet again, going back to that first breach I experienced, it's fundamental to understand what your company does, what risks it experiences or has, and then how can you structure a program that actually addresses those. I can't stress or emphasize that enough. Some of the other changes that we made, which I think were fundamental in being successful, is we actually incentivized every single employee. And when I say incentivized, we created KPIs and goals that were financially incentivized, tied to their bonuses. If they didn't meet them, they weren't going to be compensated financially. And it seems a little tough. I know that might be tough to swallow for some of you, but it distributed the program and the responsibility of security across the entire organization. And yet again, I think that's a very fundamental aspect to having a successful program. It's never about just the security organization. It's never about, we were incredibly blessed. We spent $1.5 billion on the recovery from the breach. We were able to hire hundreds of people, bring in pretty much every vendor under the sun. But even there, you realize you can't do it all just by working within security. Right? So the aspect of creating a culture where everybody in the organization understands what role they play and understands that security is a shared responsibility or a team sport was fundamental to our success. To the point where, you know, we had to be creative. Like, everybody would get a goal to make sure that they're terminating termed employees on time. Developers had goals tied to development issues. So we were able to structure it almost on a very personal level, but yet again, it emphasized how we were trying to incentivize everybody to participate. We pulled. So now we're moving on to the third C, which is still part of culture, essentially. We pulled people from other teams and other functions. I don't know whether you have entertained pulling people from say, development resources or system resources or network resources. Having an underlying understanding of a particular technology and then being able to overlay security is much easier than the other way around. So being able to bring in resources that had familiarity with the organization, but focusing them on security was another key to the strategy that we had. From a controls perspective, we had to overhaul absolutely everything. We were just recently able to publish some of the reports, the external reports about the maturity of our program shortly post-breach. As you can imagine, if there was a lower score to give a company, they probably would have given it. If it was negative, we probably would have gotten a negative. Right now, our security program baselines around one of the highest in financial services and probably rivals a lot of the banking industries. So if you kind of think about it, it exceeds even the necessary requirements for it. But we're setting a much higher bar for ourselves due to the fact that for the next 17 years still, we're under 50 consent orders from every single state attorney general, as well as trying to regain every single certification that we can possibly have, which I think at this point is close to 55 that we have to certify against. So other things that were really successful for us, and again, I'm trying to stay tool agnostic because I don't think it was any solution per se. It was more of the methodology that we approached. We decentralized a lot of our security operations, and we put security practitioners much closer to the action. Right? So whether you kind of call it a DevSecOps model or you try to borrow from some of the agile methodologies, having security practitioners closer to what the business is trying to do or what technology is trying to deliver makes them more aware of all the risks associated and gives them tremendous more context around what they should be focusing on versus the typical ivory tower or what I call shared service or funneled intake processes that I've seen in a lot of organizations previously. So moving some of that responsibility to technology, but at the same time partnering with technology was a fundamental game changer for how we were able to quickly operate. I'll give you some insights from just a block and tackling perspective. 20 years in security, I've seen many companies, including some of the ones I've entered, focus on time and place metrics. I have 2 million critical vulnerabilities. Who cares? What does that mean? What's the context? How many did you have yesterday? How many do you think you're going to have tomorrow? Right? There's not enough focus on long-term trends and determining whether an organization or a sub-tribe or however your technology teams are structured are actually doing something effective. So we started to focus on things like remediation velocities. We started looking at long-term trends. So now we have trends that go back all the way to the breach, so 5+ years of how we're executing. And we're able to get down to the point where with a lot less metrics, determine which tribes or which groups within the organization are actually doing things well, and which tribes are struggling or taking on more risk than they really should. And that, yet again, has been a phenomenal game changer. A simple, a technical one that hopefully you, if you're on a cloud transformation journey, that I want to share, we all understand it's difficult to patch certain things. We all understand that it's difficult to fix certain things. But as our journey continued to go into cloud, and specifically public cloud, we were able to move to a model where it was more important to build infrastructure as code and policy as code than to do the block and tackling of patching systems. Right? And the way that we've accomplished this is we have teams that curate images. We have then a requirement of every single application development team to take images on at least a monthly basis. If their development cadence is more frequent, great. You can do it on a daily or on a weekly, whatever you want. But we're at least assuring that on a monthly basis, they are going to be attacking and reducing the vulnerabilities associated with their environment. And as a result of that, our remediation velocity across the entire company sits somewhere between 75 and 80% on a monthly basis. Now, that's not 100. That's typically the question I get. It's like, oh, well, you're not getting 100. I will put up my remediation velocity against any company at this point, because the way that we're approaching it is we are absolutely able to take and address the most critical things in the company and the risk that we're seeing. And the remainder is something that is within our risk tolerance, or typically on systems that we have compensating controls and other things around. So very proud of at least leveraging that metric and that type of visibility. And then, from a compliance perspective, while I've always had the motto, compliance does not equal security, or compliance will not get you to a secure state, it's been a great motivator for how we're operating the program. So we had to regain almost every single certification. We failed PCI, we failed SOC, we failed everything shortly post-breach. Regaining every one of those certifications was incredibly painful, and yet at the same time, it allowed us to create an internal framework that we now publish externally. So if you're missing a framework or want to take a look at it, we've published it externally. It's something that we share with companies that are struggling there. But we sampled essentially all 160 different frameworks that were globally available, and realized that almost all of them have 80% redundancy in their programs. So our framework was just a consolidation or aggregation of that, and then it was a lot easier to kind of align every single one of the controls, what we call TRs, and essentially the implementation of those controls. That allowed us to accelerate through the certification process, regain all that trust. On top of it, I was dealing with about 150 customer audits on an annual basis. So as you can imagine, and for an additional point, maybe close to 750,000 questionnaires or questions submitted through customers. So, brutal experience there. But that in itself was something that continued to drive and validate, and continue to validate, the program that we were operating. So, as bad as it was, I do think that at this point, we're hopefully, and I'm sure many of you are our customers, you've seen a change, and hopefully you realize that we are absolutely taking data security as a fundamental focus. Some of the other things that we've done that are probably different than any company out there, yet again, going to that transparency of what we're doing. We have taken, I think at this point, 75% of our revenue is generated in cloud environments. We have internal tools that monitor the security posture of those cloud environments. But what's different than anybody else is doing is we're actually exposing that data to our customers. So customers can actually sign up, they can go to a portal, and they can see a live, and live I say up to an hour, view of every single product that they're consuming from us, and the underlying security posture of the infrastructure that's operating those products. So yet again, it was our attempt to go, we are going to be as transparent as we can be. I think in my previous breaches, I will tell you, our organizations tended not to be that open. They wanted the problem to go away as quickly as possible. They did not want to talk about which tools we had prior to the breach, nor did they want to talk about the tools that we brought post-breach. They didn't want anything to be tested. They just really wanted us to, fix it, make the problem go away. With Equifax, we really took a very cathartic approach and said, look, we're continuously getting beaten up. We know we impacted almost every single company out there because most of them are consuming our data whether they know it or not. And we wanted to lead through transparency about what we were doing every step of the way. We were one of the first companies that published a security annual report. So we give you high-level statistics like the fact that we are dealing with 39 million security incidents on a daily basis. Right? It's a tremendous, massive volume. I wish I can tap in some of the vendors that we have seen here. But because of those consent orders, because of those decrees, we actually had to internalize our entire security program, and we have to continue internalizing it and running it US only for the next 17 years. Right? So it's a challenge because it also taps into the shortage of resources or the burnout of resources in some of those areas. Cyber ops, especially some of the resources we trained and had, are very high market or poachable at this point. But it's one of those things where we're going to have to continue to focus on. Hopefully some of those things that I said are food for thought. They hopefully are common sense, right? If you are in the security space, if you are sitting at the table, you do realize that you can't do it alone within security. There are tremendous partnerships that have to be established within the organization, and even more so externally to the organization to be successful. I'll touch briefly on things like tabletop exercises. They don't have to be allowed, right? Sometimes it's as simple as a question. When all companies were being attacked by ransomware, a simple question to the board and to our senior leadership of, would we pay a ransom? Sometimes was sufficient to start the conversation and engage them to at least think about what would we do in those situations. It also exposed a lot of things that we probably weren't thinking about that weren't necessarily security problems, but they might lead to security problems down the line. I was consulting recently on somebody else's breach. I won't get into the details because it's not publicly exposed. But one of the things that they didn't realize was happening in the environment is somebody infiltrated. They made multiple attempts to to ransomware the environment. They were unsuccessful at ransomware in the environment, so they became very malicious. And they started to just blow away databases, storage, many other components. What the company didn't realize is that credentials were shared between their production environment and a lot of their snapshots and other backups, right? So not only were you impacted, but your entire DR strategy and BCP strategy just went completely out the window, right? Those kind of things were the things that we were leveraging to go, well, are we doing that? Are we making sure that we have functional DR and BCP plans, not just on paper, but actually executing them, running them, using lessons learned, forcing the actual practice to see whether we are capable of getting through something like that without actually having to pay ransomware. So I'll end there. I know it's been a long day. I'd love to get feedback on some of the things you guys are struggling with. And some of the things that you think are working well in your program. If there's anything else that you think should be a key focus, I'd love to hear that because, again, it's something we want to validate within our program. But thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the time, and really appreciate it.